Okay, so what I said. Natalie, have you already started it?
Yeah.
Okay. So the story I'm about to tell you is particularly daunting because the story is 100% true. This story was told to me by my uncle when I was about 13 or 14. And the reason why my uncle told it to me is because it happened involving my uncle. Now the story starts way back in the 1800s. The year is 1870. The place, Dahlonega, Georgia. Now at that time, Dahlonega was very famous for a gold rush that had taken place there. And many of the residents of Dahlonega had made a ton of money in the gold rush. One particular family, called the Darby family, had made out really well as a result of the gold rush. They were one of the richest, most prominent families in town. Now, Mr. and Mrs. Darby had a son, and only a son. His name was John Darby. And John Darby was about 21, 22 years old in the late 1870s, and it was about time that John Darby get married. So Mr. and Mrs. Darby held these elaborate parties, invited the most famous and influential people in all of North Georgia to come to their party so that they could find John a suitable wife to marry. And at all of the parties, John spurred all of these women, thought that they were presumptuous and pretentious, didn't want to have anything to do with them. And so Mr. and Mrs. Darby were at a loss for what to do with John. Well, one day, John decided to ride his horse into the town of Dahlonega. And instead of taking the normal way, he decided to take a detour, and he went a different way. And along this way, John came across an old farm that had been there for a number of years. And out there working in the fields was this beautiful farm girl with long, dark, black hair all the way down to her waist. And as she was working on the farm and John was looking at her, she looked up and she had these crystal blue eyes that enraptured John right from the get-go. And it was kind of like love at first sight. John instantly fell in love with her. Well, he came to find out the farm girl's name was Elizabeth. And Elizabeth and John instantly fell in love. It was love at first sight. So John went back to his parents and he said, listen, I've found the girl that I want to marry. And it's this farm girl that lives in town. Well, back in the 1870s, really rich people didn't marry very poor people. It just didn't happen. So Mr. and Mrs. Darby said, absolutely not. We forbid you to see her, let alone even date her or marry her. And so John gave them an ultimatum. And he said, either you can gain a daughter or you can lose a son. And so Mr. and Mrs. Darby thought about it, and they said rather than losing their one and only son, they agreed to let John date Elizabeth. Well, John and Elizabeth dated, and after 2 short weeks of dating, John decided that he wanted to propose to Elizabeth. So he proposed to her, she consented, and Mr. and Mrs. Darby reluctantly said, we'll throw a wedding for you. So months go by, the wedding preparations are extremely extravagant. They spared no expense for the wedding of their one and only son. They brought out all the stuff, spent thousands of dollars, which back in the 1870s was in the millions. And the wedding present to John and Elizabeth on the day of their wedding was this magnificent mansion that Mr. and Mrs. Darby built at the very top of Darby Lane, which was the family property. Huge 6-story mansion with bathrooms and parlors and studies and master bedrooms and guest bedrooms, and equipped with a full staff. Of a butler, of a maid, of a gardener, of a chef, of a cook, of all these different nurses to take care of if they ever had kids. And that was their wedding present. Well, after the ceremony, Mr. and Mrs. Darby said that they were going to have the reception at John and Elizabeth's new home. So they wheeled all the guests over to the house. And then when they took them to the house, John and Elizabeth got out of their carriage. They saw this magnificent new home, and they went inside, shocked that they got this wonderful present. Well, John told Elizabeth, why don't you go upstairs, get ready to receive our guests. I'm going to stay down here with my grooms, and we're going to hang out. We're going to smoke cigars, drink brandy, and you come down, and I'll tell you when our guests arrive. So Elizabeth goes upstairs. John's sitting in the parlor with his groomsmen, and they're talking, they're shaking hands, congratulating him on the wedding, and they're drinking brandy and smoking cigars. And all of a sudden, they hear a blood-curdling scream come from upstairs. So John and the groomsmen run up there, and there is the maid, collapsed on the ground, hands on her face, bawling, crying. And they push open the door to the master bedroom, and inside is Elizabeth, in her wedding dress, lying on the floor, dead, with a noose wrapped around her neck. Someone had snuck in and strangled her and killed her. Well, stricken with grief, John was beside himself. He launched a full investigation, but you have to keep in mind the time period. No one confessed, there was no witnesses, and the mystery went unsolved. Well, stricken with grief, John went into the woods a few days later, and he hung himself out of grief for his lost love on the day of the wedding. So Mr. and Mrs. Darby had no choice but to sell the house on Darby Lane. So years go by, people buy the house, but they never stay there very long. A week, a month, 2 months at tops, and they always end up freaking out and leaving. So over the years, investors buy the property, they try and install modern electricity, the electricity never works. They can't get anything in the house modernized. And the people in Dahlonega also said that on full moons, they started to notice weird things happening in the house. Flashing lights, weird sounds, odd things going on there. And it became a rumor that Elizabeth Darby, the ghost of Elizabeth Darby, haunted this house on Darby Lane. So fast forward to the 1970s. My uncle, who was a real estate investor at the time, travels up to North Georgia, to Dahlonega, to try and make some investments. And he gets to a local real estate office in downtown Dahlonega, and he's flipping through catalogs, and all of a sudden, he gets to the page of the house on Darby Lane. And he notices this gigantic mansion, very, very cheap. And my uncle asks the real estate officer, he says, why is this house so cheap? It's huge. And the guy tells him this story about the murder of Elizabeth Darby, the same story I'm telling you right now. My uncle, very skeptical at the time, says, there's no such thing as ghosts. Let me buy this property, I'll flip it, make it a bunch of money, turn it into a hotel. And the guy said, listen, you really want to buy this house? Check it out for yourself. If you see that there's nothing wrong with it, come back to me tomorrow, and we'll start to talk about prices. So my uncle said, fine, give me the keys and I'll go. So the real estate officer gives him the keys. My uncle drives up all the way to the very top of a mountain right in Upper Dahlonega. And he gets all the way to the top, notices this huge mansion start to appear out of nowhere. And the mansion looks a little bit dilapidated, a little bit marred throughout the years that it's been there. And he gets out of his car and he walks up this extravagant staircase. He gets to the front door, and he sticks the key in, and he opens the door, and he goes inside. And he sees a house that has been completely destroyed, vandalized, hippies, druggies, other people have been there throughout the years, completely destroyed the place. And he's looking around, and he's noticing that the rooms themselves are really great architecture. It needs a little bit of cleaning up, but the house itself is fantastic. And so he's walking around, he walks to the park, he walks to the kitchen, everything looks, although than being in really bad shape, looks pretty good. And then he walks upstairs, and he's checking all the bedrooms, he's looking inside of them, doesn't see anybody there. And then he gets to the very end of the hallway. And he tries to open the door to the last bedroom on the right, the master bedroom. And he notices that the door won't open. So he tries to stick keys in there, doesn't open. So maybe the door rusted shut, just kind of ignores it. Well, he checks out the rest of the house, and he eventually leaves. And he goes back to the real estate officer, guy, the next day, and he says, buddy, I checked out the house. There's no ghosts, there's no goblins. The house is fine. So the real estate officer says, listen, tonight's the start of a new full moon. That's when the weird stuff really starts to happen in the house. Why don't you go check it out tonight? And if you still want to buy it, you can come talk to me in the morning. So my uncle's like, okay, I'll stay there at the full moon and show you there's nothing wrong. So he gets back in his car just at dusk. He's driving up the road on the way to the Darby house. And as the sun is starting to set, he's getting closer to the Darby house. He sees the moon shining bright in the distance. And he gets to the top of the house. And he takes his cot and he goes inside. Unlocks the door. Goes inside. And he goes into the living room. And he's starting to set up his cot when all of a sudden, he starts to hear strange music coming from somewhere in the house. He's like, where's this music coming from? He's looking around, He can't figure out where it's coming from. He goes into the parlor, he goes into the kitchen, nothing. Well, all of a sudden he realizes that the music's coming from upstairs. So he starts to walk up the steps. He notices the music's getting louder and louder and louder and louder. And at the very end of the hallway, he sees a very slimmer of white light coming from the very bottom of the door, the same door that he couldn't open when he got there the day before. And as he walks down the hallway, the music's getting louder, louder, and louder, and louder. And then he gets to the end of the hallway, he notices that the door is open just a crack. He pushes the door open, and he sees a room that is completely immaculate. It's almost as if somebody's been living there the whole time. Polished silver, carpets that have been cleaned, mirror looks perfect, bed is made. And my uncle's like, this is completely odd. This is unlike any of the other rooms in the house. And he sees a music box that's sitting on the dresser that's playing this old-timey kind of tune. And he closes the music box. Well, all of a sudden, when he closes that music box, he looks off into the distance out of a window. And he notices a flashing light. And the light is pulsating. And it's getting closer and closer and closer to the window that my uncle's looking out of. And he realizes that within seconds, this light is going to be in the room. So quick thinking, he jumps into the closet. He opens the door just a crack, just so he can see. And into the room, the light comes. And the light apparates into a beautiful woman with long, dark hair in a white wedding dress. And she glides over to the dresser. She sits down. She takes a brush. She starts to comb her long, dark hair. My uncle notices that this woman is casting no reflection in the mirror at all. So thinking about the story, he says, this kind of sounds like the Elizabeth Darby. This might be her ghost. So he opens the door very slowly. He starts to approach her. very, very, very carefully. And he goes, "Excuse me, ma'am, are you the ghost of Elizabeth Darby?" Quickly, she turns to him. And instead of those crystal blue eyes, she's got black holes in her face. And the black holes are surrounded by caked blood, and blood is spewing out the side of them onto the woman's cheek. And he notices that she has a red ribbon right around her neck, right at the base of her trachea. And she looks at him, and my uncle says, "Are you her ghost?" And she looks and she goes, "Yes." So my uncle thinks, maybe I can solve this mystery. Maybe I can solve like who killed her. So he starts to think about the story, and starts to think, who was the person that maybe scared, or that maybe killed Elizabeth Darby the night of her wedding? And so he starts to think, okay, who could it have been? Who could it have been? I'm sorry, man. Can you just hold on just 1 second? Just give me 5 minutes. And so he starts to think. He goes, okay, who could it have been? Who could have been the person that killed her the night of her wedding? So he starts to think about who is there. And so he goes, perhaps it was the father-in-law. The father-in-law, he hated Elizabeth. Maybe he was the one that killed her. So my uncle says, was your father-in-law? Was he the one who killed you? And Elizabeth stops stroking her long dark hair, and she looks at him and she goes, no. So he thinks about it. Maybe it was the mother-in-law. The mother-in-law also hated Elizabeth. Maybe the mother-in-law was the one that killed her. Maybe it was the mother-in-law. So he goes, was it the mother-in-law? Was the mother-in-law? Was she the one that killed you the night of your wedding? And so Elizabeth stops stroking her long dark hair, and she looks at him and she goes, no. What thoughts? Okay, maybe it's the butler. Maybe it was the butler. Maybe the butler was the one that killed her. So he said, was the butler the one that killed you? And she goes, no. So he's thinking, okay, maybe it was the maid. The maid was there. Maybe it was the maid. Maybe the maid was the one that killed her. So it was the maid. Was the maid the one that killed you? And she stops stroking her long dark hair. And she looks at him and she goes, yeah!